April 10, 1834, New Orleans, Louisiana. Smoke billows from a mansion on Royal Street in the French Quarter. Neighbors rush to help the wealthy socialite who lives there, Madame Delphine LaLaurie. She's known throughout the city for her elegant parties, her charm, and her standing in high society. But when the crowd breaks into her home to fight the fire, they discover something that will horrify the nation. Chained to the kitchen stove is an elderly enslaved woman. She set the fire herself, choosing to burn alive rather than endure another day in that house. When rescuers force their way into the attic, they find 7 more enslaved people. What they see will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bodies bound with spiked iron collars. Evidence of starvation, mutilation, and torture so extreme that even in the 1830s, when slavery was legal and brutality was common, this crosses every line. Within hours, a mob of thousands storms the mansion. Madame LaLaurie flees the city, and her name becomes synonymous with evil. This is the true story of the woman who tortured enslaved people in her attic. The story that inspired American Horror Story. The story of the LaLaurie Mansion, the most haunted house in New Orleans, and the woman behind the horror. Madame Delphine LaLaurie was born Marie Delphine McCarty on March 19, 1787 in New Orleans. She was part of a wealthy and influential Creole family SoundCloud. Her father, Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, was knighted as the Chevalier of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis Wikipedia TikTok. By 1794, just 7 years after her birth, her family already owned 1,144 acres of land fandom. Delphine grew up in privilege, surrounded by wealth, power, and the brutal institution of slavery that made it all possible. She was educated, cultured, and beautiful. At age 13, she became involved in a scandalous affair with a 35-year-old Spanish official newly arrived in New Orleans. The relationship ended when he died suddenly, and rumors swirled that Delphine had been pregnant with his child. She was married 3 times. Her first husband, Ramon Lopez y Angulo, died in Cuba, leaving her a widow with a young daughter. Her second husband was Jean Blanc, a merchant, lawyer, banker, and major slave trader. He was also a close associate of the pirates Jean and Pierre Lafitte TikTok. Together they had 4 children. When Blanc died in 1815, he left behind massive debts totaling over $160,000, which would be over $2.5 million in today's currency Wikipedia. Delphine was forced to settle these debts by auctioning off property, including enslaved people. Records show that 8 of the enslaved people she now owned died in a span of about 5 years. Most were children or women of childbearing age. The causes of death are listed as unknown Wikipedia. This was the first sign that something dark was happening behind closed doors. In 1825, at age 40, Delphine married Dr. Louis LaLaurie, a 22-year-old physician fresh from medical school in France. He had come to New Orleans to make his fortune. She was a wealthy widow with extensive property and social connections TikTok. In their marriage contract, Delphine specified that she would retain control over her personal property, real estate, and slaves, worth $67,000. LaLaurie brought only $2,000 to the marriage TikTok. It's clear who held the power in this relationship. By the early 1830s, the LaLauries had established themselves at the heart of New Orleans society. They moved into an elegant mansion at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter. Delphine hosted lavish parties that were the talk of the city. To the outside world, she appeared to be a refined and gracious hostess. But whispers were already starting to spread about what happened to the enslaved people who worked in her home. There are records of letters written years prior by Jean Bose stating that Delphine had been brought before the criminal court for the barbarous treatment of her slaves, but was absolved for lack of accusers willing to testify they had seen her beating them Wikipedia. Even in the 1830s, when the brutal treatment of enslaved people was commonplace and largely ignored by authorities, people were noticing something was wrong at the LaLaurie household. Accounts of Madame Delphine. LaLaurie's treatment of slaves vary. Writings from 1838 feature many New Orleans residents recounting that her slaves were haggard and wretched in appearance, but LaLaurie herself was often seen being generally polite to African Americans and considerate of her slaves' health in public fandom. This contrast between her public persona and private actions made the truth even harder to uncover. Then, in 1833, an incident occurred that should have been a warning. Delphine chased a small enslaved girl with a whip. The girl, trying to escape punishment, ran to the roof of the mansion. Rather than face whatever torture awaited her, she jumped. She fell from the roof and died. Fandom. LaLaurie tried to cover up the incident, but police found the body hidden in a well. Authorities finally took action. They decided to fine LaLaurie and force the sale of the other enslaved people on the estate. But LaLaurie foiled this plan by secretly arranging for her relatives and friends to buy the enslaved workers. She then sneaked them back into the mansion, where she continued to torture them. The system that was supposed to protect even enslaved people from extreme cruelty had failed, and Madame LaLaurie knew she was untouchable because of her wealth and social status. A lawyer was dispatched to the mansion to investigate the rumors of mistreatment. Unfortunately, he was unable to find any evidence. Whatever was happening in that house, Delphine was careful to hide it well. The enslaved people who could have testified were either too terrified to speak or were already dead. The neighbors continued to whisper, but without proof, nothing could be done. Until the fire. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out at the LaLaurie Mansion in New Orleans. Locals rushed to help, as was customary when a prominent home was in danger. TikTok. What they didn't know was that this fire was not an accident. Rescuers found a 70-year-old black woman trapped in the kitchen because she was chained up while LaLaurie was busy saving her furniture. The woman later revealed that she had set the fire herself in an attempt to escape LaLaurie's torture. Think about that for a moment. This woman was so desperate to escape her situation that she chose to burn herself alive rather than endure another day in that house. What kind of horror would drive someone to make that choice? The neighbors who rushed to help were about to find out. The enslaved woman who started the fire led authorities up to the attic. What they found would become one of the most infamous discoveries in American history. 7 enslaved people were found tied with spiked iron collars, their bodies showing signs of prolonged torture and abuse. Tom's Hardware. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe scenes so horrific that even hardened residents of a slave-owning society were shocked. The newspaper reports from April 1834 described victims who had been starved to the point of being skeletal. Some had wounds that appeared to have been inflicted deliberately and repeatedly over long periods of time. There were reports of broken bones that had healed incorrectly, suggesting injuries that were never treated. The conditions in that attic were beyond anything that could be justified even by the horrific standards of slavery in the antebellum South. 7 slaves were found imprisoned in the room, featuring their own set of scars and mutilations. Some historians have questioned whether all of the most extreme claims about what was found in that attic are true. Over the years, the story has been embellished with increasingly gruesome details. Claims of surgical experiments, of people being deliberately maimed or disfigured, of victims being kept in cages too small to stand up in. The primary sources from the 19th century focus on severe abuse and mistreatment, but do not confirm some of the more extreme claims of mutilation. SoundCloud. But even stripping away the possible exaggerations, what remains is horrifying enough. These were human beings who were systematically tortured, starved, and abused over months or years. And this was happening not in some remote plantation where overseers could act with impunity, but in the heart of New Orleans, in a mansion owned by one of the city's most prominent socialites. The news spread through the city like wildfire, and the public reaction was immediate and violent. According to the Bee newspaper, a crowd of 4,000 people gathered. Neighbors ransacked the mansion and destroyed what was left of the burned building. TikTok. The angry mob made it their personal mission to destroy anything they could get their hands on. Before officers could disperse the crowd, they had managed to inflict major damage to the property. The walls alone were one of the few things that remained. The fury of the crowd was directed not just at the building, but at what it represented. The absolute corruption of someone who had used her wealth and status to commit atrocities. But Madame LaLaurie herself was nowhere to be found. The LaLauries fled to Lake Pontchartrain and ultimately relocated to Paris. TikTok. They escaped before they could be held accountable. And Delphine LaLaurie would never return to New Orleans. In reality, the mob was full of New Orleans white citizens who discovered LaLaurie's grotesque tortures. When the mob infiltrated LaLaurie's home, she and her daughters were able to escape to Paris, France, where they reportedly stayed for the remainder of her life. Tom's Hardware. She left behind a city in shock, a reputation destroyed, and countless victims whose suffering would never be fully documented. What happened to Delphine LaLaurie after she fled New Orleans? For years, her fate was unknown, which only added to the legend. Some claim she returned secretly to New Orleans and was lynched by a mob. Others said she lived out her days in luxury in Paris, never facing justice for her crimes. Madame LaLaurie died in Paris, but it is believed her body was brought back to New Orleans and buried at the St. Louis cemetery TikTok. Recent historical research has uncovered some of the truth. Delphine did live in Paris after fleeing New Orleans. She moved among French society, though her reputation followed her. There are records of her financial dealings, her property transactions, and eventually her death in 1849. She lived for 15 years after the fire, and as far as we know, she never expressed remorse for what she had done. She never apologized to the victims or their families. She simply lived out the rest of her life in exile, protected by distance and her remaining wealth. But what motivated her actions? This is one of the most disturbing questions about the LaLaurie case. Why would a wealthy woman who could have lived a life of ease and comfort choose instead to engage in systematic torture? Some have suggested she was mentally ill, suffering from some form of sadism or psychopathy. Others have pointed to the culture of slavery itself, which dehumanized black people to such an extent that even acts of horrific cruelty could be rationalized. In American Horror Story's portrayal, Delphine LaLaurie was driven by her insecurities and catalyzed by her husband's infidelities with young women, including their own slaves. She created a nightmarish beauty balm derived from fresh human pancreases that she removed from her slaves, Nicholas II. This is, of course, fiction, but it reflects the ongoing fascination with trying to understand what could drive someone to such acts. The truth is probably more mundane and more disturbing. Delphine LaLaurie lived in a society that gave her absolute power over other human beings. She was wealthy, connected, and untouchable. And when you give someone that much power with no accountability, the results can be monstrous. She didn't need a complex psychological motivation. She simply had the power to inflict suffering, and she chose to use it. Today, the LaLaurie Mansion still stands at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter of New Orleans. The structure that stands today was constructed in 1838 as a private residence and later used as a school and apartments TikTok. It's become one of the most famous haunted locations in America, featured on countless ghost tours and paranormal investigations. Historian Tia Miles has criticized the manner in which tourism and pop culture have glorified the mistreatment of enslaved people through ghost stories used to entertain visitors TikTok. This is an important point. The story of the LaLaurie Mansion has been sensationalized and turned into entertainment, which can obscure the real human suffering that occurred there. The victims weren't characters in a ghost story. They were real people who endured unimaginable torture. The story gained renewed attention in 2013, when American Horror Story Coven featured Delphine LaLaurie as a character, played by Oscar winner Kathy Bates. For the most part, American Horror Story was accurate, with the history of LaLaurie being a wealthy New Orleans socialite who tortured and bound enslaved people in her attic Nicholas Tom's hardware. The show introduced millions of viewers to the story, but it also took significant creative liberties, adding supernatural elements and fictional storylines. In the show, Marie Laveau, the real-life New Orleans voodoo queen, takes revenge on Madame Delphine for the torture inflicted on her lover, one of Delphine's slave victims. An angry mob of black citizens stormed the LaLaurie Mansion, captured Delphine, and cursed her to immortality buried under the street Tom's hardware. This is fiction, but it reflects a desire to see justice served, even if only in a fictional narrative. The LaLaurie Mansion has been sold multiple times over the years. It's been a school, apartments, and at one point was owned by actor Nicolas Cage. Every owner has reported strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, apparitions, a general sense of unease. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no denying that the building carries the weight of its history. But focusing on the haunting can sometimes distract from the real legacy of this story. The victims of Delphine LaLaurie deserve to be remembered as people, not just as ghosts. We know the names of some of them from court records and newspaper accounts, but many remain anonymous. They suffered and died without justice, without recognition, without even their names being recorded for history. So what's the truth about Madame Delphine LaLaurie? Using carefully documented eyewitness testimony, archival documents, and family letters, historians have worked to separate fact from legend. The legend has grown increasingly fanciful and grotesque over the decades, civ fanatics. Some of the most extreme claims about surgical experiments and deliberate mutilations may be exaggerations added by later storytellers, but the core facts are indisputable. Delphine LaLaurie systematically tortured enslaved people in her home. She kept them chained, starved them, and inflicted injuries that shocked even her contemporaries. When a fire exposed her crimes, she fled the city to avoid facing justice. And the legal system of the time, which protected slave owners and their property rights above all else, failed completely to hold her accountable. The story of the LaLaurie Mansion is ultimately a story about power and its abuse. It's about how systems of oppression like slavery created conditions where people could commit horrific acts and face no consequences. Delphine LaLaurie was not an anomaly. She was the product of a society that dehumanized black people and gave white slave owners absolute authority over their lives. Her story has been told and retold, sensationalized and dramatized. It's been turned into entertainment, ghost stories, and horror fiction. And while there's a fascination with the gothic horror of it all, we should never forget that this was real. Real people suffered, real people died, and the woman responsible never faced justice in her lifetime. Today, when tourists visit the LaLaurie Mansion on their ghost tours, they're standing on ground where unspeakable suffering occurred. Some come for the thrill, for the ghost stories, for the connection to American Horror Story. But the real horror isn't supernatural, it's historical. It's the reminder of what humans are capable of doing to each other when systems of power remove all accountability. Madame Delphine LaLaurie died in Paris in 1849. She lived comfortably in exile, protected by her wealth and distance from the scene of her crimes. Justice, if it exists, came only in the destruction of her reputation. Her name is now synonymous with cruelty and evil, and perhaps that's the only punishment she ever received. If you found this deep dive into one of America's darkest historical figures compelling, subscribe for more true crime and dark history content.